For many years, I've been aware of an organization called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I learned about them through allies and connections and have danced around the circles that CELDF has been involved in for many years now. Much of their work for several decades has focused on the rights of nature and community rights. This involves trying to organize and pass laws at the local level in small towns, cities, counties, and so on to revoke the recognition of corporate rights and corporate personhood and instead recognize and uplift the rights of nature. It is a form of collective municipal civil disobedience. This is the language that CELDF uses to talk about these forms of action. They say it is a form of direct action because under the existing law in the United States, it is illegal to do these things. And the organization has been increasingly criminalized along with the communities that they work with that have enacted these laws for trying to do so. They've been penalized financially by courts. States have sued to overturn these laws. Corporations have as well. And increasingly, states are even working to preempt these laws entirely. They're working to ban the rights of nature so as to stop communities from even trying to engage in this type of grassroots democracy. In response to this, the organization is pivoting. I joined CELDF in late 2024, and I'm now the co-director of a new program that the organization has launched called Community Resistance and Resilience. My work in this program is dedicated to helping communities, organizations, individuals, anyone who wants to resist the destruction of the planet through confrontational forms of action, and to also build resilient alternatives to industrial capitalism. I'm working to encourage people to share resources and training, to spread educational opportunities, and to connect people, to work as a networker and a coalition builder, to bring people together to make these actions more effective and more widespread. It's very similar to the work I've been doing for many years. In fact, it's a continuation of it. And part of my work at CELDF is also publishing a new podcast called Truth and Reckoning. Today, I'd like to bring you the latest episode of that show here on the Green Flame podcast feed. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. Today's interview is with Terry Lodge. Terry is an attorney and the legal director for CELDF. I first got to know Terry through his involvement with Protect Thacker Pass, a campaign that began in 2021 when myself, my friend Will Falk, and a number of supporters began a campaign to try and stop an open-pit lithium mine in northern Nevada. We set up a protest camp which was in place for most of 2021, and during that time, Terry assisted us in helping keep federal law enforcement off our backs. He also became involved in co-representing 2 local Indian tribes in lawsuits against the federal government to stop the mine. And he's still assisting in defending me and Will Falk, also of CELDF, from a $49,890.13 government fine that the Bureau of Land Management is attempting to levy against us for building latrines for native elders to use while praying at their sacred site, and also defending us and a group of other land defenders against a lawsuit brought by the mining company. Terry's very unassuming, but he's relentless in his work. He's been involved in defending pipeline protesters, drafting rights of nature laws, and helping communities defend themselves when they face attack and lawsuits for doing this. He's advised students protesting against the genocide in Palestine on their legal rights. He's been deeply involved in litigation against nuclear power plants, nuclear waste, and nuclear weapons. And he's contributed to the organization Veterans for Peace, helping them write letters and demands to the Secretary of State about war crimes being committed in Palestine by the Israeli entity with United States weapons. And I think one of the reasons that Terry is so humble about all his contributions is because he doesn't reify the law. He doesn't believe that the U.S. courts and legal system are some sort of objective arbiter of truth and justice. He sees them clearly as colonial institutions established to protect the rights of the wealthy and property owners against the people and to facilitate the extraction of resources. So Terry sees his work in the courts as a defensive struggle, a defensive arena in which, at best, we can hold the line against the rising tide of fascism and authoritarianism, as well as environmental destruction. And that's what we are talking about in today's interview. We discuss the sharp and accelerating erosion of free speech and civil liberties that's currently taking place across the United States. We talk about the suppression of dissent, especially regarding criticism of the Israeli occupying entity and the U.S. foreign policy supporting it in terms of weapons, intelligence, and even waging undeclared war in Yemen to defend the ongoing genocide. We discuss the rise of the corporate state and the bipartisan complicity in this. And we talk about how all of this is not actually an anomaly in U.S. history. While this is an extreme moment, there have been other times similar to this in the past in this country, where we've seen this combination of factors, foreign adventurism, imperialism, genocide, and internal repression, all happening concurrently, spiraling together. There are many themes in our discussion about the continuity here that we see between these different periods in history. We also discuss the dumbing down of public education and the increasing censorship of school curriculums and in corporate media. We talk about Terry's involvement in different public interest law cases, and we talk about the necessity and urgency of action. I really enjoyed this interview with Terry. He's a fascinating and amazing human being who's been dedicated to this work for longer than I've been alive. He's been involved behind the scenes in countless movements and protest struggles and resistance actions over years and decades. And so I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share some of Terry's wisdom and experience with all of our listeners. Without further ado, I present the interview with Terry Lodge. So Terry, would you mind providing a little bit more of your background, who you are, how you got involved in this work, and what your work has focused on in recent years and decades?
Sure. Wow. Thank you for the chance to talk. I've been practicing for more than 46 years out of Toledo, which is in Northwest Ohio, a relatively medium-sized, still somewhat factory town, but certainly a classic Rust Belt city that was smacked by the offshoring beginning in the 70s and ever since. And it's kind of been an interesting practice. I've been flying solo for most of that 46 years, and I was an early fan of Ralph Nader, whose philosophy, as expressed in the late 60s on into the 70s, was to try to inspire more people to become interested in the public interest side of law. And so I'm sort of like a classic Nadery in that I came from the anti-Vietnam War generation into environmentalism as an activist before I went to law school even. I kind of take some pride historically in having been an activist come to the law instead of a lawyer who suddenly or gradually becomes interested in a cause. My causes, thankfully, tend to govern the directions I've gone with my practice. It's been very interesting. Over the years, I've done a great deal of civil and some criminal litigation. It ranges from defending protesters to advancing free speech claims to trying to protect the civil rights of people who've been abused by police overreaction, to a lot of jousting against commercial nuclear power in the administrative suites in Rockville, Maryland. And in more recent years, I've been a staff attorney for CELDEF, working on the defense and advancement of initiatives, actual locally generated legislation through the courts. And in the now that we are in the epoch of genocide, where free speech is endangered around every corner, I've been involved most recently in the last year and a half in things related to consulting with university students about their rights, or if they're actually facing disciplinary kinds of dangers, as well as working with some of my National Lawyers Guild comrades in some larger anti-genocide work, including I'm co-counseling with several incredible people on a pending complaint filed last week with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is part of the Organization of American States. We filed a complaint against the Biden and Trump administrations, the United States government, for its perpetration of the genocide in Gaza.
So I want to drill in and focus on this because you've been involved in a lot of anti-war work over the years. And as you mentioned, the genocide that's going on right now that is the Israeli state is perpetrating in Palestine. We're seeing as a result of that here in the United States, or rather we're seeing that used as an excuse to dramatically expand a crackdown on civil rights, on rights to free speech, rights to protest. This is what sparked our conversation here. Many people who are listening to this podcast might have gone through CELDEF's democracy school or be familiar with the analysis that's laid out in these democracy schools and by CELDEF and by many other organizations and people throughout history, looking at the United States not as this paragon of democratic virtue and organizing throughout history, but rather as a state that emerged through the genocide of Native peoples and built a legal structure in the U.S. Constitution and the law that's evolved since then that's built to uphold property rights, the rights of the wealthy and the rights of the ruling class, essentially, against the rights of people. And the parts that we think of as being so integral to American democracy, such as the Bill of Rights, were sort of added on after the fact only through the concerted efforts of social movements and reformers and revolutionaries who saw the need to build some sort of protection for these basic principles of democracy and plurality in society. So, Terry, I'm wondering if you can speak to what's happening right now in terms of, precisely what is happening in terms of these erosions of civil rights and free speech across the country. I think a lot of us have been following the headlines, reading the news, but I'm not a lawyer. Most of our listeners aren't lawyers. And so I don't think necessarily many of us understand what precisely is happening and what the significance of it is. Can you speak to that?
What's happening is phenomenal. And 25 years ago, I was sort of on a local lecture circuit against the passage of the USA Patriot Act, which contained a bunch of groundbreaking provisions legalizing illegal surveillance and turning a blind eye to obvious trends that were ultimately aimed at identifying and controlling dissenters. And I remember 22 23 years ago lecturing people about, I'm an old guy and I'm telling you that it hasn't always been this way. It hasn't always been this way, but the tendency is very deep rooted and has been. The arc of, I guess, our history has been in the direction of what we're seeing today. In circumstances that would be dark comedy in any other situation, the jingoistic invocation of anti-Semitism is very hypocritically being mobilized as a means of shutting down dissent about, most immediately, about the genocide. And it is being used successfully to draw a knee-jerk reaction that is sort of akin to red baiting during the McCarthy era and during the anti-Vietnam War era, where terrorism is the new communism, and red baiting by calling someone terrorists and anti-Semitic for questioning an industrial grade, incredibly mediaized genocide is incredible to me. It's just astonishing to me that people are being told to ignore their lying eyes, and it's a joke, and of course not a funny one. It's just a calamitous kind of thing that we are being triggered by stereotypes, which is not new, but by mass marketing of stereotypes and idiocy and foolishness that people are being asked to respond to. And when they don't, boy, the hammer is dropped, and people's lives and careers and even their being allowed to stay in the United States comes into immediate question. So this is sort of an early stage of very dramatic reshifting of the corporate state. This is the corporate power, corporatocracy, capitalism, greed, and profit are, of course, major mainstays of our culture, but the consolidation of corporatism with government is very largely complete. The Trump administration is the most recent cynical agent for that, but this is a bipartisan crisis. And I mean, we are in this crisis because of so-called bipartisanism. Looking back only decades it's really horrendous. I remember feeling a lot of pangs of regret and rage and hostility and defensiveness and all during the Vietnam War era because of repression and spying and informants, and I mean just the relentless documenting of everyone in those days, those horse and buggy days when things were typed and faxed and written down and all that. But the warp speed with which information and misinformation gets trafficked these days is breathtaking.
You were talking about the Patriot Act, and I came of age politically in that, 9/11 era. I think I was probably in 6th or 7th grade when 9/11 happened. And so invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, the rise of the anti-war movement, the rise of, anti-Muslim backlash in the United States, the Patriot Act and other forms of government crackdowns, increased mass surveillance of the people, CIA black sites across the world, the proliferation of those and the publicization of those, the rise of government sanctioned and government defended torture at places like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. That was like the context in which I was becoming politically aware. And
interesting.
It brings to mind, I first heard it from Mumia Abu-Jamal about how war is utilized by the imperialists first and foremost to crush internal enemies. And it's quite interesting to me that both in that period, 20 years ago now, 20 plus, and now we're seeing war genocide rather right now, being used as an excuse, being used as a leverage point, an opportunity by the state, by the corporate state, as you say, to do exactly that, to crush internal enemies. And so, it seems that after 9/11, 24 years ago, I know there was massive public pressure leveraged against anti-war intellectuals, people who are critical of American empire, people losing their jobs, being fired, being ostracized. And now this is, happening in a very similar way, but probably being taken to the next level much more significantly than it was 24 years ago. So yeah, I'm curious as well. I know some of the examples of where this is happening. Obviously, the administration has been targeting places like Columbia. It's been targeting other universities and the students who you mentioned some of whom you've been consulting with. But I think we've also seen it begin to infiltrate other areas in civil society and and move into different arenas. We've seen funding being cut for government grants being cut for groups that have expressed sympathy with Palestinians or consternation over the mass killing of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people, most of them civilians. And I'm wondering what other things you can point to in terms of these erosions of due process, these civil rights violations, these arbitrary targeted attacks, and sort of a revenge approach towards using the political apparatus, and widespread corruption in the government right now, and how all these things are linked together.
Right. There are a number of structural trends, deteriorations, I guess I would call them, that have been going on for decades, and things have kind of reached this crisis point because of them. The dumbing down of public education since the 70s. In the 70s, I remember some pretty far-reaching discussions and writings by people who were talking about the religious right that really emerged after Roe v. Wade and began to harden into public foundation-driven pillars of right-wing activism, soon followed in the late 70s by what they were calling at the time stealth candidacies to things like school boards and lower echelon governmental posts, which began a new era of book and literature censorship in schools and in public libraries, where they were elective positions. Also, the severe erosion of union representation in the workforce has fallen by something on the order of about 40 or 50% since the 70s. And as I say, the dumbing down of public education, where you have local school boards that are deciding curricula in very exclusionary ways, which is now at a fever pitch. The ability of parents to censor school libraries for the entire school just because they don't want their kid to see a book about diversity, but also that has spread over into curricula management by school board fiat, ultimately by state officials, Florida being a really horrendous example. So you've got that kind of trend going on. And as I say, the success, as it were, of the corporate state, where most regulatory bodies have been very successfully populated by appointees from the industries or with significant backgrounds in the industries that they're regulating, who are effectively corporate pawns. So you have the regulatory model, which fictionalizes some security that things are being managed, things are being watched. We're a diverse, advanced, technologized society. Somebody's minding the store, and then the train runs off the tracks. The planes crash, the nuclear power plant, suddenly something goes amiss, and questions are finally asked, but only belatedly. So you have the corporations successfully infiltrating the mechanisms that are supposed to restrain them. You have the court decisions in this century, like Citizens United, that have tremendously enabled corporate purchase of the best Congress and government that money can buy. These are the kinds of things that are happening, and it becomes necessary in a society that is so dependent on war as an economic function that the mentality be changed. One of the things that was not exactly normal, not exactly a normalized activity as I was growing up, was war. And the Vietnam War was very upsetting because it ran for more than a decade, and it was preceded by U.S. Secret incursions and trainings of foreign troops and all that kind of stuff. And then Vietnam was finally over, but it was not long before the United States intelligence apparatus got us involved in other intrigue in other parts of the world, and more. And we have now, of course, in the last 35 years, reached a state of effectively permanent warring against multiple small nations, bombing from 30,000 feet. We have an increasingly antiseptic, technologized means of warfare. We have an increasingly massively defense-dominant federal expenditure model going. And these things require, they're both the product of, but require more and more brainwashing, I guess I'd call it.
You're talking about the link between war and overseas war, the projection of imperial power, the projection of domination, and the suppression of dissent internally at home. And this is something that historians and activists and social critics have pointed to these connections for a long time. People have said the chickens always come home to roost. And we were just having a conversation, planning an upcoming event with some allies in the Philippines, some organizers down there, and discussing the links between, for example, U.S. imperialism in the Philippines and the repression of dissent internally here in the United States. So it seems like these are two sides of the same coin, right?
Very much. Yeah, we're in there are Orwellian features to this, but that doesn't completely explain what's going on. The Orwellian features are that we are now constantly here in Oceania, we're constantly at war against or threatening war against large and small enemies, lumping them together, although sometimes they begin to find one another and unify against us. But on the international plane, there's just this endless conjuring up of the need for more and more expensive defense, for more and more that in turn leads to a need to manage our society in more and more spotless ways, that democracy is increasingly trashed as being very, very inconvenient. Participatory democracy in particular is targeted. The ancient power of people to legislate their own laws through initiatives is under increasing question. The consolidation of the media has made it easier for the amplification and disproportionate emphasis on stuff that doesn't matter or that is marginal in its importance or significance to us. That's how you get junk TV. You get People magazine. You get the fixation on trivia and nonsense and sensationalism. I mean, we have become very much a yellow journalism kind of driven society because scandal and shock and gossip are what sells and what diverts.
Right.
It diverts attention away from the really serious problems, the massive unsolved and in fact expanding problems within as well as outside of the United States. So what it translates to, and what we're looking at right now, is such an incredible time, and I use that word a lot, but it's an incredible time because impunity is the order of the day, and the genocide that is going on is finally revealing to the current generations the utter depravity of the directions we're heading as a planet, as a society, as an economic structure. We have no values anymore. And the problem is that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, said a couple of years ago that genocide in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. And when he made that pronouncement, he was talking specifically about the fact that climate chaos is creating growing numbers of what I guess you could call climate refugees, but people who are affected directly by desertification, by the massive transformation of water resources, by mining, by the need for new raw materials for the supposed transition away from a carbon-based economic model. And so the problem is that genocide is not an aberration. It's not an aberration in history. It's not an aberration in American history, but it is part of the U.S. And I'm now realizing the international delusion is that we've advanced beyond all that, and we aren't genocidal maniacs, and we aren't just going to sacrifice huge populations because of political economy, but we are. And so this is an incredible time. I use it again because of the fact that the classic American exceptionalism is getting a run for its money finally, but the whole notion that somehow it is all right and even necessary to keep your head down and avert your gaze from what is going on, we can't do that, or if we do so at grave peril. And so I look at the repression, looking at the wildly retributive and venal acts of the Israelis. I mean, they really go out of their ways. Last week they bombed a crew of people in North Gaza trying to drill a water well, after, of course, the Israeli Air Force has systematically destroyed water treatment systems and water piping and pumping devices and all that. But you look at the amazing depravity and the fact that there are people cheering it, the fact that there are other governments taking favorable notice, or at least keeping notes of how to repress and destroy entire populations. The fact that Trump is an admirer of Duterte, of in the past of Putin, of other strongman leaders, and that so much is the tenor of the planet. And the fact that we sit day by day watching the absolutely inexorable, inevitable genocide. And our political leaders, I noticed that just in the last couple of days, Macron and Starmer and the new guy realizing there's a genocide going on. They're finally realizing that starving children on the internet are just rather inconvenient, but they're not moved to actually take concrete action. So I'm ranting at this stage.
Well, yeah, it's worthy of a rant. I mean, the situation is ridiculous, and I think it's good that we started where we did in a way with this conversation with you talking about the Vietnam War and you coming of age politically in that era and me coming of age politically in the Iraq Afghanistan era. And and now there are all these young people who are coming of age in this era of the genocide of the Palestinian people. And there's a through line to all of this. And, you can
Yes, there is
sort of breadcrumbs back through US history. As you said, genocide is not an aberration. And there's a direct link between the breakdown of rule of law, the illegal deportations of people to, essentially torture facilities and concentration camps in El Salvador, and many historical examples of similar behavior. The Trail of Tears of the Paiute people, the Trail of Tears of all the other Native people getting marched to Oklahoma, the suspension of the government today talking about the suspension of habeas corpus, and the use of sedition laws and treason laws against people like Edward Snowden and people like the Rosenbergs. There's a through line between the corruption of Trump trying to accept this massive plane from the government of Qatar, his cryptocurrency schemes to pump his wealth as high as possible while he's in office, just completely leveraging his government position for personal gain. This sort of complete breakdown of any even semblance of ethical moral behavior is a precursor to public respect and votes or the ability to gain power in a society. That it's sort of, we're in a phase, one of these sort of cyclical phases, it seems like, where the gloves come off of empire. And those who are paying attention can see the naked face of the violence, the brutality, the domination, and and those who will oppose it will be hit by that fist. It's a raw wielding of violence and power as a form of domination. And this, to me, I think is really instructive because it speaks to how this bipartisan approach to empire and power in the United States plays out, where we have the Republicans and people like Trump as corporate fascists and Christian fascists, and then we have the Democrats as sort of failing to even uphold their own supposed liberal values when they're in power. We have Obama, assassinating people around the world, ordering illegal drone strikes, assassinating American citizens, waging war without the approval of Congress, all of these things being baked in, being incredibly cozy with corporate power and massive donors and so on. And in some ways sort of solidifying and normalizing the expansions of imperial power that were conducted under the Bush administration. The Obama administration sort of normalized those and sort of brought legitimacy to them through diplomacy and very good speeches and essentially a great public relations campaign. I mean, Obama's campaign was called the best marketing campaign of the decade or of the century or something at the time, right?
Yep.
And Biden sort of attempting to do the same thing, to sort of whitewash all these imperial crimes, to normalize so many of them, and to of course the genocide began under, I mean, this phase of the genocide, I should say, began under an administration, and he sort of primed the way for what Trump is doing in so many different ways. And it just seems like this more than ever is an important time for folks like us who have a radical analysis of this history to educate, to speak to young people, to reach out in the community, to help people understand that this is how empires operate, that we're in, so scholars talk about this as being a sort of competitive authoritarianism where, the processes and the structures of supposed democracy and Republican form of government are being used to enforce an authoritarian form of rule and, undermine whatever vestige of democracy did exist in the first place, which was already pretty, it was kind of a joke even before the Trump administration came into power, for those of us who have been paying attention, right?
Yeah, if you've been paying attention, exactly. Just to discuss for a minute some of the close-up harbingers that I still am left aghast at the brazen nature of what is going on by way of inculcating fascist operating principles into our daily lives. Let me give you a couple of examples. One of them is that few people know that in 2017, and during the first Trump administration, the Congress, with very bipartisan support, particularly in the Senate, enacted a statute that makes it a 20-year federal felony prison sentence and up to $1 million fine to support the boycott of Israel. There's a statute on the books. There's an update of it, which would add in as potential offenders incorporated nonprofit entities. This, of course, is aiming at the actual BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, International Movement, but also American Muslims for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, other groups that are openly advocating BDS as a non-violent means of trying to restrain what's going on in the Middle East. In right here in River City, in Columbus, Ohio, the state capital, there's legislation pending that is very likely to pass that would incorporate the so-called IHRA, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, definition of anti-Semitism into Ohio law. And it is supposedly, the cover story is that it gives a firm definition of anti-Semitism for civil rights investigators who are looking at the potential for religious discrimination to have occurred in the workplace. But what it also will do is it creates a state legislated law. Basically, it says this is what anti-Semitism is. And along with the IHRA definition come 11 examples, I should say, among which are that any criticism of Israel as a political entity is deemed anti-Semitic. The ultimate purpose of this is it's beefing up Ohio's ethnic intimidation law, which is it's a crime to discriminate against someone because of their ethnicity, race, religion. But by adding it into the ethnic intimidation statute, which can range up to being a felony, it also adds heft to enforcement of the riot and aggravated riot crimes in Ohio. A riot in most states, including Ohio, is typically defined as 5 people or more getting together for the purpose of committing a misdemeanor or a felony. So a riot is 5 people who lock themselves down to an office building. A riot is 5 people or more who gather in front of or let's say in a university quadrangle to protest a genocide. It's a riot if something turns into civil disobedience or worse, physical attacks on police, that sort of thing. But it now, if this law passes, as we anticipated very well might within the next 6 weeks, by the end of the fiscal year, it will become a crime to gather for the purpose of protest. It will become possible for the campus cops at your friendly local university in Ohio to read posters, read internet, Facebook, other social media announcements of a protest scheduled tomorrow noon in front of the administration building. The cops will arrive and say, since you people are gathered to protest the genocide, you are committing anti-Semitic acts, you are in order to disperse now, or we will prosecute you for riot and ethnic intimidation. So it will be possible to shut things down before they even start, which is why I'm a great admirer of the graduation speakers and the young people who are sitting down and sitting in and protesting in as best as they can on campuses, and faculty, of course, too. But this stuff is happening daily. It's happening at warp speed. Legislatures and Congress are looking at additional repressive measures, such as one of the things in the big, beautiful budget bill is, once again, the ugly head of empowering the Treasury Department to unilaterally cancel the 501c3 so-called tax-exempt status of nonprofit organizations, which is, in capitalism, you get to take a tax write-off when you donate to an organization that you feel is doing good, maybe doing humanitarian work or education or some forms of trying to inform the public. 501c3 status, in other words, is what foundations get their breaks on. It's what corporations get to write off, and individuals. And it is proposed that the Treasury Secretary, without having to disclose any evidence, be allowed to terminate a 501c3 organization's tax-exempt status, which will critically harm hospitals and school systems and many, many other activities, simply because the reason that the Treasury Department has to give is that they have evidence which they do not, I'm telling you, do not have to disclose, would not have to tell you that you have contributed to anti-Semitic or other unlawful activity in support of terrorism. And you know what? That means everybody in environmentalism, everyone performing social functions and education are at risk. They're at risk of jeopardizing the economics of their employer because of their viewpoints. I mean, this is amazing. People that want to start alternate education facilities, homeschoolers under some sort of nonprofit organizational kind of aegis, people who want to do environmental organizing and what would normally be considered legitimate interventions in regulatory stuff, in lobbying, that sort of stuff. They can be. This isn't just cancellation, boy. It's destroying populism and the means of democracy, such as they are at the root. So, yes, there are a great many things that are happening, and like I said, like I told you and others, these days it's like we're all drinking from a fire hose because we're under such intense pressure from so many different directions, having to respond meaningfully. So the place that I see it necessary to respond is whenever someone's right to speak is endangered, that you defend it. And to some extent, you defend speech that you would certainly never endorse yourself. But the very opportunity for us to participate is being undercut, and critically so. I mean, we're seeing, like I said, the censorship of school curricula, the right of viewpoints to even be expressed without being shut down or the subject of a complaint, we're seeing people being encouraged to be hypersensitive to criticism without teaching people how to mediate differences and how to peaceably discuss and explore and resolve differences whenever possible. We are living in a society awash in guns, and yeah, I keep thinking of how the fact that the only legislation the National Rifle Association ever supported that would restrict gun ownership was when Congress was considering bills to get at the gun ownership of the Black Panthers 55 years ago. But we are in a society awash in weapons as a means of resolving differences. And since internationally it's our way or the highway, and we will bomb your defenseless country with our incredibly technologically advanced jets at 30,000 feet. I mean, if that's the way we resolve differences, no wonder we don't trust one another, and we arm ourselves, and people who have no sense are toting guns to demonstrations to show people at the demonstrations that they better watch themselves. I mean, wow, boy, have things gone completely over some edge somewhere.
I've had the old quote from the German pastor Martin Niemöller, who was in a concentration camp and is well known for his saying, "First they came for the socialists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist.
Yep.
Then they came for the trade unionists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist." So on and so on. And then he says at the end, "Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me." And I'm just reminded of that right now, as unfortunately so many swaths of society are silent as immigrants and pro-Palestinian activists are being targeted brutally and ruthlessly and illegally by, even under our very insufficient and often unjust legal system as it exists now, even under that very poor bar, illegally targeted. So many people are silent. So many people are silent about this. And, as you said, even if you don't agree with everything, even if you have some political disagreements with these people, what is represented by the crackdown on dissent, on speech, on activism, on resistance, what we are seeing right now is profoundly disturbing. And it's indicative of, again, what this organization has talked about for decades now, which is this through line in United States culture and law of authoritarian genocidal tendencies. And that it's more important than ever at times like this that those of us who have a heart and are disturbed by what we're seeing, we speak out, we take action, we be brave, we be bold. That doesn't mean being stupid, because there's obviously the political circumstances that we're in right now are quite dangerous, and it's not a time for action without thought. But, on that note, Terry, do you have any final words about, ways to push back, assert our rights, and continue to push?
Yeah, and it's a little bit more than writing your congressman. Let me tell a little story. Last year, I was fairly involved with a number of other activists. We had a long-time Democratic Senator, Sherrod Brown, here in Ohio. And Sherrod was, back in the day, back in the 80s, he entered politics, and he was a pretty hard, for the times, leftist, and he supported a great many in state legislature. He supported a number of really significant reforms to Ohio's environmental and landlord-tenant laws, some other stuff. He ends up getting elected to Congress, and he's still in the early 90s. He's still kind of tough, and stood for things. He was an ardently pro-union, and signed on or led the charge on some legislative attempts anyway to shore up the embattled industrial unions. And he became a senator, and he was running against a a Trump endorsed right winger, and he was going to have a very tough re-election race, very tough, and in 2024, and it was, and he lost, but he lost because he would not, in any way, in the slightest way, criticize the genocide. And I was part of a group that confronted him a couple of times at appearances in Northwest Ohio, and I actually was present at a UAW picnic where he, in answering one of the questions from one of us, said, "This is not a genocide." This is in July or August of 2024. That what is going on in Gaza is not a genocide, and he proceeded to his talking points were garbage. But I'm thinking this guy is like one of the liberal lions in the U.S. Senate, and his career, his vanity. I mean, he's in his early 70s. He doesn't need to be reelected again, except for ego. He's a 3-term senator already. And I thought a lot about the fact that the Dems were avoiding the mention of genocide. That they were whispering it in timid language at all, if at all. And it's amazing. We've watched the spectacle of people showing you that they are not going to protect your life and limb. They aren't going to, they're not going to take steps to intervene to prevent crises that are befalling people daily in this country as well. And so I've thought a lot about what the hell does it mean? So what you have to do is people are going to have to take stands that are going to be difficult, that they're, people are facing career destruction that is immense. And the stakes for us as individuals are extremely high, and the prices that we're going to have to pay are commensurate with the gravity of how bad things have become. So, yeah, you start out with hounding your congresswoman or your senator, I guess. But more than that, you start focusing locally on self-help groups on groups that combine in ways that are mutual aid oriented. There's more need than ever for people to understand food production on their own, to understand that the political system can be taken on, but it has to be taken on with unified action. And that kind of gets back to your point about how we're going to have to realize and make adult evaluations as to whether people are more our allies than our enemies. And that means talking to people that are outside of your social media, maybe, or people that you have had sharp disagreements with, but there's got to be some need to find common ground, because I think the responses are going to have to come from the bottom up. I've always thought that, but more than ever, we're seeing that the top down is absolutely brutal and senseless and unforgiving. So we have to develop new ways of growing trust among ourselves, among identifying who we are, and taking a view that is frankly very socialistic, because that's the only way that I think that many people are going to be able to survive, is by plighting their troth in common with other people on a lot of issues. So local governance, a healthy skepticism of what politicians, at least from the traditional party stripe, angle are really saying and what they're really putting on offer. Those are developing an acute sense of critiquing and dusting off the old idea of seeing people in person and seeing people not just on the streets but in meetings and in discussions and in exchanges that aren't just point and click. That's a kind of a beginning. And then educating yourself as to the options for activism and ultimately leading into civil disobedience. There are ways of making a point, sometimes humorously, as a group. There are ways of doing things that are minor lawbreaking. Of course, nowadays everything is being amplified into crime of the century to thwart people from protesting. But educating yourselves as to what is possible strategically. Talking across generations is another one. There's an awful lot of boomers who have nothing but bad advice, or who will tell you that they were anti-war, but that they got past all that, or they realized that America was, ultimately the Vietnam War was wrong, but everybody makes mistakes. But there's a need to get across generations, and there's a need to understand the value of history. And that means that you do have to talk to people who've been around for a while and see if you can gain their perspective on what actually happened historically. And like I said, it's sort of interesting to me now that I was once young, but now 50 years later, I'm understanding a great deal about. I've lived through historic events, and when I read what the mass media puts out about Martin Luther King, or Vietnam, or the Central American Wars, or the Persian Gulf War, or the 2003 Iraq invasion, I lived through that stuff, and I have a really, oftentimes, very different, richer understanding and memory. So their institutional memory, I guess I would call it, is also a valuable thing, sort of in the almost the Native American way of preserving history by talking. I don't know if any of that helps, but
it does, Terry. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. And these issues are not going to go away easily. Obviously, you've been at this fight for 50 years now, and things are in some ways a lot worse than they were in
yes,
the 70s.
And you just raised a very, very good point, which is that what we're talking about, and this isn't necessarily all gloom and doom, but you have to pay attention, and you have to pay attention on a more or less continuing basis. It's not like you're going to be able to invest a few months or a few weeks or a year in something and figure it'll be problem solved and you can walk away. I was an activist around 1969, 70 on into the 70s against Vietnam, and I remember immense relief when it was finally over or nearly over and all that. And I kept thinking things will return to normal, and you don't, nothing goes back to what it was. It's that old thing about history may not rhyme, but it echoes. And what happened was, as I've half jokingly said over the years, is that the lesson the entire world learned from Vietnam was don't do stupid elective wars. The lesson that the Pentagon and the military establishment in the United States took from Vietnam was don't have a draft. Have a more malleable, uniformed workforce. Be a little bit more circumspect about your global imperialist aims. We never were going to return to normal. We returned to a bruised, bloodied nation that never resolved a lot of problems that were exposed by the Vietnam era. And I can say that of the success, you're going to have to protect your families and especially your children, and you've got to keep teaching yourself, and that requires more or less continuing activism for as long as you can sustain.
Yeah. Yeah, every empire falls. And I think for myself and many people, active in these movements, that's in some ways a consolation for us. The challenge, of course, is what state are our communities in? What state is the ecology in? What state is the nuclear arsenal of the world's nation in as these collapses and political shifts accelerate, as these empires, these civilizations that have destroyed their ecological foundations start to stumble and falter and eventually fall? Are we able to build a path towards more peace, more localized, small scale, low energy societies, towards good relationships between ourselves and the members of our community and the land? Or is it, descending further into an authoritarianism, into reactionary xenophobia of the worst sort, into the violence and, exclusion and force as the answer to every problem that we face? And, this will continue to be a struggle here for quite some time, certainly for decades, and who knows how exactly the future is going to play out. But to me, the work always must continue to be done. We have to just plug away at it and continue and continue and continue, and not expect, to win, not expect for some great utopian future to emerge tomorrow. It's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that our efforts are useless. It just means that it's more important that we put ourselves into this work as a long-term commitment, as a commitment to transforming ourselves, our communities, our own relationships, our society, the world that we live in as a whole. That has to be a lifelong process, I think, for all of us. And maybe with generations of that type of work, we'll chart some sort of way out of this very, very difficult place that we have come to after, as you said, genocide is not an aberration. And this culture has been built on generations of genocide, slavery, exploitation, land theft, brutal foreign wars, colonial occupations. Not all societies do that. That is not necessarily human nature.
Right.
It's a latent possibility within all of us. It's always there beneath the surface of possibility. But we can make different choices and move in different directions if we can set up our cultures and our ways of thinking, our ways of governing and relating with each other to move in those different directions.
Yep, very true.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to celdf.org. That's celdf.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.